last 20 weeks, you've started to get the bigger picture. And part of the big picture is all of the violence, all of the sinfulness, all of the walking away, all of the destruction, all of the bad things that happen in the Old Testament. How many of you have seen that in your readings, in the scriptures, in the message? Yeah, it's there. How many of you, though, have also seen a God that is persistent? There's the message for us, isn't it? We sometimes look at one isolated piece of scripture and we say, look at that. They did something wrong and God wiped them out. The Amalekites, let's just choose those. How many of you remember the Amalekites? No, don't raise your hand. They were a while back. Remember when the people were going into the promised land and God says you need to make sure that you have gotten rid of all of these people that occupy it now. And we said, oh, what a horrible God. And one of those is the Amalekites. Now here's the big view. Guess what Haman was? An Amalekite. There's no love lost between the Amalekites who were displaced and those who were Israelites, Hebrews, people of the nation of Israel or Judah. And because they didn't finish the job, Haman arises with an axe to grind. And he wants to put to death all of the Jews. All of those. He wants to finish what his people couldn't do earlier. And only now he's got the power of Xerxes, the king. But what he never counts on is that the people of God have a secret weapon. Well, not so secret weapon. They have God. That's the only one they needed. That is the ultimate deterrent, isn't it? We like to think that nuclear weapons were that for a lot of ages, but it isn't. It's God. God will have his way. And it doesn't always go the way that we planned. It doesn't always go the way that we hoped for, but it always goes the way that God intends in the end. So the story breaks down very simply like this. And if you haven't read the book of Esther, you need to go back. It is one of those marvelous books, one of those books that many have questioned whether it should even be in the Bible. Why? Well, because nowhere in the Bible is there another book where God is never mentioned, where God is never prayed to, where the rituals are never followed. Every other book has at least some mention of it except the book of Esther. That doesn't mean that God's presence isn't felt there. It doesn't mean that you can't see God working through all of that. You certainly can. And you do. But it's a different kind of book. It's a beautiful book. Why? Because you have a young, beautiful woman who becomes king, or the king's wife, over some very peculiar circumstances. Now, this is a very depraved kingdom. Unlike every other political situation in the world today, Persia was not one of those enviable kingdoms. It was filled with debauchery. It was filled with all sorts of sinfulness. And the whole story starts out with Vashti the queen being deposed. Now, why would a biblical story start there? Well, just to show you how depraved it was. You see, the king throws this half-year party. I guess he didn't figure he could fit it into 3 months, so he had to have it in 6. And at the end, they have this huge banquet for days, and all of this drinking that goes on for days. And when they're finally drunk enough, someone challenges the king to have his wife come out in all of her finery. Now, it doesn't say what he meant by that, but it wasn't good. The queen was having her own very quiet, very subdued party with women in the kingdom. And she refuses. She said, I'm not going to come out in front of all those leering and jeering and groping men just for your pleasure. Well, that was a fatal mistake on her part. Not fatal, death-wise, but fatal as queen. You don't refuse the king anything. And that sets the story up, doesn't it? Now you understand why Esther draws back a bit when Mordecai says, you just need to walk up to the king and say, you need to save the Jews. Look what happened to Vashti. He regrets what happened to Vashti, and he cast her out of the kingdom. But nonetheless, he is bound by his own rules. Haman is his henchman. He is the number 2 in command. And Haman has it out for the Jews. Now, one of the twists in all of this is he doesn't realize that Esther, and by the way, even the name Esther is kind of a play on the name for the goddess Ishtar. I want to compare her to that beauty. Her Hebrew name was Haggadah, which is myrtle. Well, myrtle the flower. She was a flower. In all of this, it boils down to that very critical moment. Good stories always do. There's always the climax in the story, isn't it? You can't wait to get there. And this is the spoiler. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want to know the end part, cover your ears now. But in all of that, her cousin, her father, challenges her and says, Esther, what if God has prepared you for just such a time as this? Esther reminds me of another young girl who was challenged with almost the impossible, a New Testament figure called Mary. And God says, Mary, God has prepared you for this time, for this deed. Esther, God has prepared you. And Esther exclaims like Mary does, if I perish, I perish. Mary says, I will become the handmaiden of the Lord. Women, strong women, accepting the challenge to stand in the face of all of the adversity, of all of the sinfulness, of all of the things that their society and culture had made go wrong. All because they have the strength of God within them. Well, the whole story ends with everything being turned back on Haman. But I want to ask again that one question. What would have happened if Esther would have said no? Would it have changed the outcome? After all, this is the book of Esther, right? It's Esther's story. And what if she had said no to Mordecai? What if she had not gone to the king? What if she had turned away in the face of God? My guess is it wouldn't be this book of Esther. But let me turn that back a little bit, because this is the point where sometimes we get confused. The book of Esther is not about Esther. Esther's the heroine, but it's a book about God. It is about God's persistence. It's about God's love. It's about God's protection. And so God continually steps into the story, into the picture, and offers his help, his protection, his love at each point of the way. And that's where we sometimes get confused, isn't it? We say, all of this is about these other people. But it's not. The Bible is about God's continuing story of his love for all of us.